Paul Street believes that I am part of what he calls the Trumpan left. Even though he speaks eloquent truth about the evils of the Democratic Party, as do Norman Solomon and David Sirota, his criticisms of Donald Trump, Trump's followers, and most importantly, his use of the terms fascism and proto-fascism give me the sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach that his readers are getting duped. Joe Brunoli, in his article Capitalism, Nationalism, and Militarism, A History of American Fascism, gives us an excellent and historical overview of what fascism actually is and what it isn't. Joe says that we need to stop thinking of fascism in terms of people and more in terms of systems. The fascist states built by men such as Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, Pinochet, and Milosevic were not the cults of personality that we believe. Rather, they were highly integrated, culturally engineered societies that worked to perpetuate and strengthen the fascist system internally while expanding the system against perceived enemies externally. Paul makes the mistake of blaming Trump for fascism, and in some ways even saying that Trump equals fascism, and therefore Trump's followers all are fascists. What he doesn't understand is that the system, the fascistic system, was not invented by Donald Trump and has been around for a long time. And I just caught myself saying he doesn't understand, and this is where I think sheepdogs need to be scrutinized carefully. Probably he does understand, and he probably is controlled opposition. Paul Street is way too smart not to understand what I just said. Another point that Paul is way too smart not to understand is made in Norman Solomon's article. In 2021, the best way to fight neo-fascist Republicans is to fight neoliberal Democrats. In my mind, that was a huge ding, ding, ding. Now, even though I've said many times that Norman Solomon is a sheepdog, sheepdogs often say things that are absolutely on the money. What most caught my attention in Paul's article, Why There Was No People's Rebellion Against a Fascist US President, 9 Reasons, is how snarky and condescending he sounded, and he doesn't usually sound that way. Snarky condescension is the surest sign of shitlibbery. This is about 2/3 of the way down the article, and here is the heading, The Ridiculous Trumpan Left. That immediately smacked me in the face as being written by a shitlib. This is his 9th point. 9th, intellectuals and activists of all kinds flopped egregiously when it came to the task of grasping and explaining the real nature of the threat posed by Trump and Trumpism, as opposed to saying fascism. He's making Trump the problem instead of the system. At some point in the not-so-distant future, I will write an essay on the failure of most of the academic and intellectual class, with notable exceptions like Jason Stanley, Anthony DiMaggio, Henry Giroux, and perhaps Timothy Snyder, among a few others, la-di-da, when it comes to understanding Trump and Trumpism as fascist or at least fascistic. We now have the truly nauseating and comical absurdity of historian and noted fascism expert Robert Paxton reversing himself and deciding that Trump is, yes, a fascist after all on January 14th. 3 exclamation points. In the meantime, can the left, such as it is, have a reckoning with its oxymoronic Trumpan left? A number of self-proclaimed lefties I know need to take a long look in the mirror and explain why they said and did so little against a fascist White House. Some of them actively aided and abetted the monster and his backers. This guy has Trump derangement syndrome very bad. Sadly and absurdly enough, given the fact that the neo-Bircher American right, SMH, would gladly lynch every Marxist and left anarchist they could get their hands on if they ever seize full state power. That sounds a little hyperbolic to me, Paul. When Obama was president and I was writing and speaking overtime against Obama's nauseating and murderous neoliberalism and imperialism, I didn't see comrades deflecting away from my radical critiques saying, oh well, but what about George W. Bush, whose horrible presidency I also wrote and spoke against at length? That was appropriate. Bush's crimes didn't exonerate Obama any more than Tiberius's crimes exonerated Caligula. La-di-da. Then we got an actual malignant pandemo-fascist president. Donald J., go back to your crime-infested country and let's electrify the southern border and COVID-19 affects almost nobody. Trump. Droves of online lefties met my consistently Marxist criticisms, generally combined with properly scathing critiques. Properly scathing. Now that sounds like controlled opposition to me. Properly scathing critiques of the corporate and imperial Democrats' appeasement of the demented fascist oligarch Trump, with seemingly endless deflections to the undeniable awfulness documented at no small length by the present writer of Obama and Hillary Clinton, as if I hadn't regularly and systematically exposed and denounced that awfulness, like I did with W and like I did with Bill Clinton when I first started publishing on current events in the late 1990s. It seems to me, Paul, that you're telling us these things about Obama and Clinton and so forth because you want us to believe you when you tell us how bad Trump is. What is this Trumpin' left? A term I seem to have invented. Well, aren't you clever? For me, it refers to the heartbreakingly large number of avowedly left thinkers and activists, I'd rather not name names, many published in the same venues and platforms where my writing appears, who dismissed, mocked, and smeared leftists, liberals, and progressives' concerns about Trump and Trumpism, fascism as hysteria, childish wolf-crying, stupidity, virtue signaling, identity politics, political correctness, and collaboration with the corporate neoliberal Democratic Party. Well, some of those shoes might actually fit there, Paul. For the many open and more commonly de facto Trumpin' lefties in my orbit during the Trump presidency, it was more important to own the libs and smack down the Democrats than it was to fight white nationalism and fascism. They spent the years under Trump reflexively deflecting to the undeniable sins and culpability of the Democrats the minute a left or progressive or liberal thinker dared to mention the dangerous conduct and trajectory of the Trump White House and its backers. I think you're overstating that, Paul. Even I, author of at least 4 books and literally hundreds of radically critical left anti-capitalist essays on the deeply conservative corporate capitalist imperialist and objectively white supremacist nature of the Democratic Party and its leading standard bearers, had to receive innumerable lectures on the evil of the Democrats nearly every time I criticized the in-power Trump, his party, and or backers between 2016 and 2021. You poor baby. In some rare cases, I ran across, air quotes, leftists who actually embraced Trump's election and presidency, absurdly positing Trump as a pro-working class populist and anti-imperialist. Paul, I think you're making that up. I don't remember anyone coming out quite that strongly for Trump. There's nobody I can think of who actually did that, so maybe you should name names here. For the Trumpin' left, the bane of my inbox and social media accounts for 4 years, it was as if the Democrats were the only ruling class party that mattered. This, even as Trump committed one new outrage after another with the open assistance of the Trumpified Republican Party and the help of Democratic appeasement. Well, there was Democratic appeasement, admittedly. Some of the Trumpin' left's key identifiers. Constant deflection from the fascist Trump to neoliberal Obama and the Clintons and the dismal Democrats more broadly combined. I have to say, Paul, dismal I know is your favorite word, but you may be using it a little too much. Dollar-drenched, dismal Democrats, although I loved it the first time I read it. Anyway, the dismal Democrats more broadly combined with constant false equivalences between Trump and the dismal Dems. Let's hear some evidence, Paul, that they aren't equivalent. The recurrent false claim that the two major U.S. capitalist parties are the same, as if properly seeing them both as capitalist, imperialist, and white supremacist organizations means to idiotically claim that they are identical. Nobody claimed they're identical, but yes, they have a lot in common. If that makes me an idiot, so be it. Constant rediscovery of something we all know on the actual left, that the Democrats are capitalist, imperialist, and racist. Caught your typo there, did you notice? Absurdly inordinate energy focused on criticizing Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, the leftmost people in Congress, of all the people in elective federal office to hold up for criticism. We'll get to that in a minute, Paul. An often Green Party-affiliated ballot fetishist obsession with who you did and didn't vote for. Paul, if you vote for a corporatist or tell us to vote for corporatists, you are an asshole. Sorry if I have a fetishist obsession with that. The nauseating charge that you were an ally of despicable corporate Joe Biden because you didn't want a second presidential term for the fascist Donald Trump. So how can you say that you're not an ally of despicable corporate Joe Biden if you tell us to vote for him? Recoiling at the notion that Trump and Trumpism are at all fascist and claiming falsely that it has been mainstream liberal conventional wisdom to call Trump fascist all along. Not true, actually. No, it's fair to call Trump a fascist. That's not wrong. Lack of reasonable specificity in the use of the word fascism, and you, Paul, are far more guilty of that than any of the people you're complaining about, leading to the defense of Trump and Trumpism against the charge of fascism with the claim that the fascism-appeasing Democrats are themselves fascists. They are themselves fascists, and Joe Brunoli lays out the reasons if you'll go back and read that. It's a great article, it's on due dissidence, and I doubt you've read it yet. It's the fascistic system, and not its fascistic cult leaders, that we need to deal with most. You are the one who is confused about fascism. Claiming that the Trump base is motivated primarily by economic grievance rather than mainly by white supremacism, nativism, and sexism tied in with authoritarianism. Dude, you really need to pull your head out of your ass if you think that that's true. You are writing off right populism completely, and you're doing it because of your privilege and elitist attitude. Now, this next point Paul makes is empirically true and statistically literate, so I just want to make sure that you understand by his use of the opposite words, it doesn't mean he's right. The empirically false, statistically illiterate myth of Trump as a product of working class support. You really are missing the boat here. Trump is a product of working class support. You can't just wave that away. Now here is probably the most grievous part of this whole article. Undue enthusiasm for fascist propagandists like Tucker Carlson, combined with a bizarre willingness to channel right-wing propaganda, for example, the Hunter Biden charges that the dodgy Trump and libertarian Glenn Greenwald revealingly tried to make into a Comey moment for Trump on the eve of the 2020 election. You don't need to know anything else, dear viewers and listeners. This guy doesn't merely need to pull his head out of his ass, he needs to pull his head out of the asses of his oligarchic owners. And then he's trying to conspiracy shame. He says common overlaps with 9/11 trutherism, Seth Richery, anti-maskery, and anti-vaxxery. And even though he admits that Russiagate was false and a conspiracy, he says creepy respect for Putin, Assad, and the Hindu nationalist and militarist cult member Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi's main sin was that she endorsed Joe Biden. You shouldn't pull this Russia crap up when you already acknowledged that it's false. Claiming that Trump was just another corrupt neoliberal, no different than any other. And that's what Caitlin Johnstone said. So if you're branding Caitlin Johnstone and Glenn Greenwald as Trump and lefties, you are a piece of shit. Calling Trump a populist in a good way, recurring mistaking of the episodic lesser evil imperialism of Putin's Russia as some kind of principled anti-imperialism, I think you're definitely overstating both of those. Again, I want to remind you that alarm bells should go off just as you read the tone of his condescension. In this other Counterpunch article, Two Populisms, Not One, Paul again puts forward a lot of truth, but he has this problematic bent here with right populism. Look how he describes right populism. Then there's the reactionary, anti-cosmopolitan nationalist populism of the right. This unattractive and backwards-looking populism shares some of the left populism's disdain for giant globalist corporations and financial institutions. Still, its ire is aimed primarily at immigrants and racial and ethnic minorities and their perceived liberal and multicultural champions in the globalist elite. I don't think Paul knows very many actual Republicans. Paul is dealing with caricatures. I don't think he actually knows people. I, on the other hand, grew up with lots of actual Republicans, and I don't think this characterization is completely fair. There's truth in it, but it's a caricature. He goes on, still, its ire is aimed primarily at immigrants and racial and ethnic minorities and their perceived liberal and multicultural champions in the globalist elite. This white nationalist populism, some would say faux populism, who would say that, Paul? Carries no small whiff of fascism. It aligns with noxious politicians like Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, France, Alexander Gauland, Germany, Matteo Salvini, Italy, Nigel Farage, England, Viktor Orban, Hungary, Geert Wilders, Netherlands, and Jair Bolsonaro, Brazil. Again, he's showing his confusion of what fascism actually is. Now let's go back to the conclusion of his previous article, where he finishes with a flourish of sneering condescension. I have to say, Paul, it doesn't make your argument stronger, especially for those of us who are trained to sniff out sheepdogs, and especially for those of us who have been trained to sniff out controlled opposition. The online Trump and left hasn't missed a beat just because Trump and his fascist minions physically and murderously assaulted the US Capitol in support of Trump's big election lie. I know you'll call me a conspiracy theorist, Paul, but I don't think it was completely a lie. It is railing against government repression of the fascist right, against Trump's banning at Twitter and Facebook in the wake of the attack on the Capitol. There is no fascist right other than the system, people. Trump followers are not really fascists. They're racist bigots, yes. They're not fascists. And they, like you, don't even really know what fascism is. And then he criticizes us for being against Trump's banning by Twitter, which is obviously stupid. Against Trump's banning at Twitter and Facebook in the wake of the attack on the Capitol, the two social media giants had no choice after the failed putsch attempt. And even against the open fascist Steve Bannon's banning at YouTube, which the 2016 Green Party vice presidential candidate has, proving that the mostly older and Caucasian Trump and left is not 100% white. That was a low blow. Absurdly called the ultimate example of, you guessed it, fascism. Banning Steve Bannon is fascist, and so is banning Alex Jones, whether we like them or not. Banning people is fascist. If you speak for banning them, you are a fascist. That's why he doesn't want us to understand what fascism is because we'll see that he's the biggest fascist of all. There isn't anything more fascistic than censorship. Numerous people with whom I share publication outlets and social media networks have opposed the impeachment of Trump for instigating a fascistic coup attempt that killed at least 5 people and seriously injured many others. How laughably pathetic, and in some cases cynical. My eyes never stop rolling, I can see them now, Paul, at the soulless buffoonery of these low-brow imbeciles and scornful charlatans on the red-brown edges of what remains of the American left. Holy fucking shit. Now here's the part that Paul isn't saying, that I, rightly or wrongly, attribute to him. And I say this because I believe that the only reason to make Trump out to be Satan, whether or not he actually is because of an ulterior motive. The primary ulterior motive that I attribute to all sheepdogs, not just Paul Street and Norman Solomon, is that they want to keep voters and their energy within the Democratic Party tribe because they believe an inside solution is possible. That is, they believe that the only way out of our troubles is to somehow redeem and or force the Democratic Party to solve the problems we face. And that simply ain't gonna happen. Not now, not ever. The absolute destruction of the Democratic Party is the only way we'll ever expose the Republican Party for what it is. Yes, we need to destroy them both, but the Democratic Party must be destroyed first for people to understand the scam we've all fallen for over the last 70 to 100 years. Once left-leaners work together to expose and then abolish the Democratic Party, we can get to the business of helping right-leaners understand how badly they've been taken advantage of by the Republican Party. Most importantly, we can help working-class Republican voters, once they can stop being fooled into believing that the Democratic Party is their only enemy, to be able to recognize, without smoke being blown up their asses, the plutocrat behind the curtain, the puppet master of all politicians and pundits, for who he actually is. Once left-leaners fully embrace the idea that we should attack the Democratic Party first and stop pretending that Republican voters, as opposed to neolib wine moms, are the primary enemy. Are you listening, DSA, Jacobin Magazine, Norman Solomon, Noam Chomsky, Sam Cedar, Vosh the Sheepdog, Cenk Uygur, Anna Kasparian, Emma Vigeland, David Dole, Mike Figueredo, Cristo Ivalis, and on and on and on ad nauseam? we'll understand that anyone trying to do anything from within that evil party is standing directly in the way of progress and becomes our primary enemy and not merely a distraction. We don't hear enough true leftists saying things like Chris Hedges is saying here.
Might have been an exception, but most of them really have no ethical base. They shift. I mean, Biden has no core, no real belief system. He just, he moves with whatever the currents are. The political class throughout history has been held in check by, well organized and even militant popular movements. That's just incontrovertible. And as Howard Zinn points out in The People's History of the United States, all of the opening, I mean, we built a closed system, the white slaveholding elites, and you read the Federalist Papers, they were terrified of especially direct democracy or popular democracy, and all of the movements, the abolitionists, the suffragists, the civil rights movement, the labor movement. We had the bloodiest labor wars in the industrialized world. Hundreds of American workers were murdered. That is what opened the democratic space. And those movements alone, if we don't recover those movements and rebuild them, and they're never going to be built within the confines of the Democratic Party, then we are going to, as we already are moving very swiftly, towards this kind of corporate totalitarianism with the censorship imposed by, as it already is being imposed by these huge media platforms that can control the ability of literally, at this point, I guess, billions of people to communicate.
That's what fascism is, Paul. So if the Trumpen left is composed of Glenn Greenwald and Caitlin Johnstone, are you also lumping Chris Hedges in there with them? He's definitely making the same points. Paul, I'd say it's pretty clear right now that you're out of your league. We simply don't hear enough true leftists saying what Chris is saying here about a revolution coming straight up from the streets and bypassing both corrupt parties. That's what you're afraid of, Paul. That's what all sheepdogs are afraid of, that we would bypass both corrupt parties. That's where we begin to wonder where your bread is buttered. That's why we relentlessly attack AOC and even Bernie Sanders. As we utterly destroy the irredeemable DNC, we will need to begin on the left edge first. In other words, we will need to begin by discrediting and removing the distracting sheepdogs first. Then the rest of the dominoes will fall left to right as we forge a new system that is actually democratic instead of an oligarchic good cop/bad cop system led by controlled opposition politicians and pundits. As Lenin famously said, the best way to control the opposition is to lead it ourselves. Yes, Paul Street, I'm speaking directly to you. Intentionally or not, you are serving as controlled opposition, and we'll never get anywhere until we can get you out of the road we want to travel on.